Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another Gaudium at Space 22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I am pleased to be joined today by a repeat customer, Dr. Matthew Meinard, who teaches philosophy and moral theology at St. Cyril and Methodius Byzantine Catholic Seminary, which is out in Western PA near Pittsburgh, right?
The other side of Pennsylvania. I mean, I'm not going to count you as a Philadelphia person because I don't want to insult you that way.
That's
Um,
true. That is
but
very true, and it would be an insult.
well, you're the other Rust Belt. It's like you know what I mean. It's like the
That's
Rust
right.
Belt to get back up
I'm
there.
up
So,
in the
but
Scranton Wilkes-Barre area. It's the old coal mining
yeah,
steel area. Yeah, Rust Belt. I don't claim Philadelphia, and I lived 20 years in the Lehigh Valley, which I loved. I truly love the Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton, Lehigh Valley area. It's really, I think, a great place to live. But you're out west, where my friend, my dear colleague, Dr. Rodney Hauser is from Bedford, which is out in
I thought so. I've got friends from out in Bedford. I swore you told me that, and I've been listening because isn't he's moving though down to Florida,
Florida. Yeah, that's
which
right.
is like that's weird for me. I mean, you're from the northern Midwest too. Florida's like a vagrant
Yes,
community to me. I mean, I know there are natives to Florida, but it's just like hot, swampy, people who move there who don't live there. It's a weird place, but I
his
understand
wife,
it
but
recently.
his wife Kelly is from Florida,
That's right. Yeah, he did.
and
You
yeah,
did say
her family is originally Bahamian, and so but they lived in Florida. She grew up in
that.
Florida,
Interesting.
so they're absolutely thrilled to be heading back to Florida,
And I
which
think I
they love.
saw it just yesterday. I was only able to listen to part of your podcast. Is Caitlin Smith Gilson going down there?
Yes, she's there
I,
now.
okay, that's just interesting because I saw her at a thing at Mundelein. I just met her on and off over the years. And I only got to talk to her for a little bit. I was trying to pull her aside at the end because, like, I mentioned someone we both knew, and she perked up. And you know how the end of conferences are that everyone has to
Yeah.
like run and get to their plane.
Oh, yeah,
It's
yeah.
interesting. Yeah, that they.
I met her for the first time, as I said in the podcast yesterday or 2 days ago, at the new Ray Sourcemont conference run by Word on Fire.
Mhm.
I spoke there. She spoke there. I had not really known very much about her at all. And then I heard her speak at that conference and was blown away, just absolutely blown away. First off,
Yeah,
just by the brilliance of the talk, but she's a very intense speaker, too.
she's incredibly intense. She's
Yeah.
incredibly intense and sort of like hugely. I mean, synthetic is not the right way to put it because there's a certain kind of, and I mean this in the positive sense, but like there's a certain poetic style to her, or she's drawing big connections
Well,
narratively.
yeah. Well, the thing is,
Uh,
she is a poet. She's written books of verse
oh, I
and
didn't know she's.
poetry.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
didn't
yeah.
know.
She's
Okay,
a philosopher. She's a poet. She's a
there you
theologian.
go.
She's one of those
Yeah,
polyglot types that just great. By the way,
what
I'm
wound differently than me. We
oh
scholastics are like,
yeah,
we
very
have
much yeah.
boxes. We have boxes to put ideas
Yeah.
in.
So we're gonna talk. We're gonna talk today about a few things. But anyway, I'm very glad to see that you got the swag
I
that I sent you.
even
Unfortunately, you
though
got the left-handed one instead of the right-handed one, so you have to hold it like
I have to
that.
like keep reminding
Um,
myself so I can
we
show.
do
Yeah,
have. I have to redesign this though because the
yeah. It's like
Gaudium
you
of
have to
Space
hold it like
22.
all
Yeah,
the way up to the
it's
screen.
yeah. There you go. The lettering is too small. My wife was joking yesterday, Carrie. She said you ought to just have like a big picture of your face with all kinds of like Our Lady of Guadalupe stars and moon and stuff coming off of it. I thought, no, thank you. We're not going to do that. But anyway, but hey, welcome to the show.
Yeah, good to be here. I love opening banter. This is just sort of like a normal thing people have said. I was on years ago, and I kind of my earliest thing I ever did a podcast was with Michael Lofton. I mean, Michael's sort of gone his way. I mean, I don't want to really
Yeah,
go there
I was
because
on
I
his show a
own
couple of times. Yeah,
yeah, I because it was during COVID. I was sort of like the lonely extrovert. And I remember one night we came in and I think it was my dad was dying. And so my wife, I actually told her just go ahead and stay with the kids with your parents because it's just easier because I'm going to be in and out of the
yeah,
house. And I came in that evening, and it was COVID. You couldn't see people, right? So like you had to leave the hospital after being there for an hour or whatever. So I'm here alone, and I come in and start talking to Michael, and we basically bantered like this for 15 minutes before we started. And all these people are commenting. I didn't come here for banter. I said banter's part of the project. But here,
yeah, yeah.
I'm gonna throw you a curveball because it came to my
Yeah.
mind just as we started. I'm not trying to take over your podcast, but
You
I've
do
been
it.
curious about this with you actually. Just talking about Rust Belt stuff and all that. Did you grow up with ethnic Catholicism?
No,
I'm really in a sad mood about like how Christmas is
no.
so different nowadays. Okay, so you really didn't. And
I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is a very Protestant city. Catholics are a definite minority. And it's also not a very ethnic city. And my mother's from Omaha and she's Italian and from an Italian neighborhood. Omaha has and I think still has ethnic Catholics, mainly Irish and Italians. But Lincoln is just where I grew up. It was just suburban Crackerville.
Yeah,
E
it's yeah, and it was you would have been when would have been formative for you? Like the late
60s, 60s, and 70s.
60s and
I
70s.
was I was
Yeah.
born in 58. I'm 66 years old. So yeah, I mean I grew up in the whole hippie generation and all that kind of stuff, but very, very, very suburban, typical middle class,
Was it
crackerjack
already
white.
suburbanized basically when you were?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it was.
yeah.
It was. And I, I went to public school my entire life until I went to seminary for the first time. So no, but I know that you've been lamenting lately because I've been reading it, the demise of Christmas traditions and so forth associated with ethnic Catholicism. I mean, not only did I the Christmas traditions, I didn't have any ethnic stuff, but also my father was a fireman, so we were not allowed to have real Christmas trees. So we always had the fake Christmas trees sprayed to death with fire retardant. And
Oh, geez. Like he was a very precautious
well,
fireman.
he had been to many, many, many a house fire on Christmas season
Yeah,
over the
yeah,
years, caused
yeah.
by overly dry Christmas trees with very hot Christmas lights strung up around them. And all it takes,
Yeah.
the other thing, you get your Christmas lights back in those days at places like Kmart. Uh, them having a sort of arcing shorting out situation was fairly common.
But
And
yeah, yeah.
put that on a dry tree and
Oh, a
boom.
dry tree. When a dry tree goes up, they're great. Like at the end of the season, because when you have some
Yeah.
property, you just burn them when you're done, and yeah, they just go straight up. You think, well,
Yeah.
that's not my house.
So yeah, okay. So
But
this
yeah,
is the curveball. But before the
yeah,
curveball,
that's
I
fine.
just want to
Whatever. Yeah.
no. I want because I want to get to this curveball. That's fine because before we went on, I want everybody to know we don't have a strict script for today's show. I really like Dr. Minard. I've had him on my show before, and I just felt like I want to reconnect and have him on the show again. And normally I don't do a lot of banter because I think a lot of my guests don't like it, but I don't mind doing it today because we're reconnected. Anyway, for those of my viewers who don't know, I mean, Dr. Minard is in fact not just a professor at the seminary; he's a Ruthenian Rite Catholic, but he's also an expert in the philosophy and theology of the neo-scholastic period, 19th and into the 20th century in particular, and he is a translator extraordinaire and a sort of recoverer of great sort of manuscripts that have been from thinkers like Charles Journet and so forth that are threatened with being eclipsed. And we've discussed in previous shows, if you can look it up in the archives on my blog, so some of the sort of conflicts between the Resos Mont Communio guys and the Thomistic guys. So that's who Dr. Minard is as a scholar. But we're not going to talk about that today. We decided before. No. So I don't mind the curveball. So there is something to be said then about I know you see it here in where I live in the Scranton Wilkes-Barre area. You see all of these Scranton especially is a much more Catholic city than Wilkes-Barre, and there is a lot of Irish Catholics that were in Scranton, a lot of Italian Catholics that were in Scranton, and there are old ethnic like the ordinariate parish that I worship in, St. Thomas More, was originally St. Joseph's Catholic parish that was shut down because it was a Lithuanian parish.
Yeah, that they
And all
probably just had. I mean, you just had a generation that was probably from, coal mining early steel that just it eventually hit the demographic cliff runs off. Ruthenian church is a bit like this too, let's be honest, in the Rust Belt. I mean, out west it's a bit different because there are a lot more self-selected people out there. Yeah, I just think about it every year when like especially Christmas even more than Easter because I think we have all these sort of emotional ties from our childhood to Christmas because of all
yeah,
the festivities and whatnot. Just thinking about the state of Catholics' minds right now and people sort of, losing their mind over issues of tradition, just broadly. I'm not even saying traditionalists per se, but just the role of like that kind of continuity with the non-Catholic elements of culture that are in the background of all those traditions that just gave a
that's
ballast
right.
to people to keep them insane or
It's
keep them
true.
sane, not insane, right? Like a enculturated Catholicism that's just lost.
Yeah, and
Um,
it's hard to keep those traditions going when the culture gets lost. I'm
yeah.
go ahead.
No, it's like, I feel like I'm not trying to give you red meat, but it's like whenever liberalism dissolves it. It's, I mean, when it does, whenever a kind of rootless
Yeah.
vision of individual people. I'm reading some Pierre Manon, so I'm in a mood. But
Oh, yes. Dan Mahoney and Paul Seaton are the two
I
people
just,
that really turned
yeah,
me on to
Mahoney
those.
just the
Yeah.
translation he did of the natural law and rights, the Gilson lectures he did. Just I've never I
Yeah.
had read it, and so I got it
And
recently.
Daniel Mahoney has a new book coming out next year. I can't think of the name of it now. He sent me the title. But
I thought it came up when you had him on. Yeah.
yeah, I want to get him back on again because he is just brilliant beyond belief. And I loved his book, The Idol of the Age, Idols of the Age. And he's got another one coming out. So I hope to have him back on the podcast here very soon. But then, of course, Paul Seaton
Mhm.
is boy, he's first class as well.
He's a great guy.
And
He's a great guy too. I've met him
oh
a couple
yeah,
times.
I've had him on the show,
Yeah.
and I should probably have him again. So Paul, if you're listening, let's do another show. Try and get Dan Mahoney. We'll do another show. And but so anyway, you're reading Pierre Manette. So you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, right now I'm just sort of filtering it, right? Because the problem is I'm probably filtering him through Sokolowski, who's one of my professors, Monsignor Sokolowski, because he
Yeah, I
was
should
in
mention you got your PhD in philosophy from the Catholic University of America, I
yeah, from
believe in
US
2017 or so.
17, yeah.
Yeah, and you studied under Sokolowski.
No, he was. I mean, this is not meant to cast shade on others, but of all my professors, and I hold my director Tim Noon in high veneration too. But as a philosopher, Sokolowski has a real special place in my heart because he was a real, actual, just he was a mensch who thought, like you know what I mean. Like he was really just engaged
Yeah,
with the problems before him. Um, yeah, so
and
there's a
yet
bit of like
and
this
yet
sort of
you're a Thomist and he's a phenomenologist.
yeah, but he's not. See, he is and he isn't. Because because the Husserlians read him and they say that there's a huge amount of Aristotle. He's an Aristotelian Husserlian, is what he is.
Well,
Um,
and that's JP too. I mean, people
yeah,
say, "Oh, John Paul II was into that phenomenology." Oh, for crying out loud! John Paul II, and it was a version of Thomism called Lublin Thomism, that is essentially Thomism read through the lens of Husserl and a few other people. But it's very very Thomistic.
yeah. No, and it's clear whenever you interact with Sokolowski. And it's clear too. I mean, the Wotia, I kind of am looking forward to the fact they're doing the new translations to sort of be able to digest it all together. Because
Yeah,
it's like I still feel like you're in two worlds, but I think that's the state of the texts because I'm no expert in him. I felt like that old translation of the acting person made me want to
yeah.
rip my hair out. I mean, that's how you got
Yeah,
to where you're
well.
at.
Did you hear my interview with David C. Schindler then,
Yeah, I listened to about the
where
first like
I
40
just
minutes of it. Yeah.
inadvertently said I had a really hard time getting through the acting person, and David picked up on that right away, saying, "Well, there you go. There's your problem. That's the title of the old translation, and the old translation is apparently just atrocious, just
What,
beyond atrocious."
well, what's the new
And
translation? What's the title? Is
it's
it a different
the yeah, it's a different title. I think it's called
person
the
in act?
person in act. I think it's
Person in
called.
act. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, I
There's
think that, I think so since I kind of grew up at the end of his papacy, I only have like snippets of him. And so the stuff that's like the closest to my wheelhouse are those like early essays. There's like a little volume, it's a Brown thing, Person in Community or something.
oh yeah,
Like
yeah,
that, it's a mixture of that's a mixture of Shaler and it's rather Thomist actually. Um,
yeah.
and
No,
so
I'm JP2 to my core because my first year in seminary was the year he was elected pope, and
yeah.
man, it's hard for me to communicate to the younger generation of Catholics how unbelievably inspiring John Paul II was to my generation, and it's sobering to me, very sobering, and well, maybe sobering is not the right word, it kind of bracing. It took me a long time to catch up to the fact that there's a whole younger generation of Catholics out there, more traditional, who think of John Paul as a kind of liberal modernist. And
Yeah.
and that just drives me crazy, to be honest with you, Matthew, because I mean, when you grew up in the era of post-Vatican II conciliar nonsense, and John Paul rode in onto the scene like a knight in shining armor in 78 and puts Ratzinger in his head as CDF. I mean, he was vilified by the
Oh,
Catholic
yeah.
left as a right wing, arch conservative,
Retrograde
horrible.
whole,
Oh,
who,
yeah.
yeah.
And so my entire adult experience of JP2 has been defending him against the liberals. So it took me a while. And I remember when I went on Bishop Barron's show and he said the same thing. It took both of us a while to finally wake up and realize one day, wait a minute, there's a whole new group of people rising up to criticize John Paul who thought he think he's like a liberal monarchist.
Yeah, this is, I mean, well, it is an example of like the changing of generations. You're right,
Yeah,
because I'm born what, 84. So I'm sort of, I'm not in with the younger millennials, right? Like I'm sort of like the oldest of their group, and I don't quite have the experience of like for whatever these categories work, Gen X before me, kind of between the two. Because I still have that sense of what it was like when I started to care about Catholicism, which was more near the end of my high school time. I mean, I grew up in an observant household, even though my parents were divorced. They were very insistent on
yeah,
us going to mass. They were very, my stepfather's family in particular was a very conservative. They would have been traditionalists. His father would have been a traditionalist if it had
yeah,
existed in the area I
yeah,
lived.
yeah,
Um, but it kind of left a mark on him. But from the time I had a sense of Catholicism, you kept wanting to point to Rome. I mean, this is what caused. So I had a sense of the kind of papalism. The couple years when I was a Benedictine, that would make me annoyed with some of my fellow seminarians and fellow less than monks, but seminarians who kind of were so obsessed with Rome at the time. But the
yeah,
reason for that was because when stuff was insane
yeah,
with your local
yeah.
parish or with your formators, you kind of felt like you could keep pointing to
That's the thing.
Rome.
That's the thing. The center held. You did. It wasn't because you were ultra montane in your theology or ultra papalist or cult of personality or anything. It's just that the sad fact was the lunacy that surrounded us in the broader church was so extreme that the only thing you had to cling on to was Rome and the
Yeah.
papacy. And I don't want to go down this rabbit hole. We discussed before, and we don't really want to talk about this. But I think one of the problems that we face today in the church is then this growing perception that Rome, et tu Rome, that Rome too has sort of drifted into bad
Yeah.
waters. And so, oh gosh, the center isn't holding. And now the center's not anyway. We don't want to go
No,
there.
and you can see, I know we're trying to avoid it, but it's hard when it's like my expertise and our passions, right?
Yeah.
You and I've had our differences. I mean, people aren't even privy to, people with strong personalities like us are going to have our disagreements.
Yeah.
But listen,
We've had a
Larry,
few.
I am sometimes accused of being like a liberal or sneered at because even though I do Gary Goulet-Grange and other people as well, I came to him through Maritain, and Maritain
Yeah.
left a huge mark on me. One of the reasons I love Journet is because Journet and Maritain were close. Even the work I did, like John Henry Nicola is a guy who's between two different eras, right? And boy, we're like in an era where all of a sudden it's that people are just they're sort of losing their mind. They want to just hit that reset button. And as an Easterner, maybe this is close enough to what we're passionate about, but not going down the hole of what we fear that we'll get sucked into. As an Easterner, I can't give up the stuff from Vatican II ecclesiologically.
Yeah.
Like it is a hugely important council for the identity of the Eastern churches.
Yeah, I get a lot of that from Eastern Rite Catholic friends of mine, Daniel, Father Dozier, and people like
Hmm.
this who say, "Look, the sort of Latin Rite Catholic trads who hate Vatican II need to understand, man, oh man, for us Easterners, that was like a godsend."
Yeah, and it was two different experiences too. I mean, if you look at the outcome, whatever one says about what happened with the liturgy in the West, boy, in the East, I mean, it really actually set a program of liturgical improvement in our churches because we basically, as we shed some of the Latinizations, at least the less Americanized churches. That's what the issue is because the Ruthenians tend to be a little bit more Americanized, right? It's not just Latin; it's that we gave
Yeah,
in. And there are actually some historical reasons for that. Like if I wanted to go down that rabbit hole, but the ethnic conflict in America, basically. But if you look like the Melkites, for instance, I mean, they just have there's solid texts for all the liturgical texts. Because that's even
yeah,
what I use for my prayer. I've got like all the Minea and everything. And it really started a real
yeah,
renewal that helped, I mean, parochial practice become, far more big O Orthodox traditional. I mean,
yeah,
the goal in our churches is a kind of orthodoxy and union with Rome. And our experience at the council, it's like two totally different experiences. I think some people who are Easterners who grow up Eastern don't realize that. If I can, because you will enjoy this because it shows two different experiences of the church.
sure.
I was teaching a class I got stuck with this class on sort of history of like Vatican II, because basically Christian Kappas said to me, yeah, it's way outside your wheelhouse, but you do stuff at the beginning of the turn of the century and you'll be Orthodox in teaching it. So I'm just going to let you bumble through some iterations because I need someone who's not going to just teach their opinions. So at one point while we were reading, we were dealing with some of the adjacent no salvation is outside the church, like how to understand that stuff in Vatican II. we use Dominus Jesus sort of as a historical arc, just to sort of say like the reception of the council. We're not going to carry it through to today, but let's take it through Dominus Jesus. So I assign it,
Mm.
right? Dominus Jesus 2000 on unicity of salvation in Christ. And one of my students who grew up in the eparchy out your way in Passaic, he's a priest now, he's a really good guy. He looks at me almost dumbfounded during the beginning of the lecture, like, sort of just, what do you guys think about the reading? He said, I didn't know it got this bad that you had to say something this obvious. Right. Because
Wow.
he had not seen that what had happened so mainstream through so
Yeah.
much. Right. And that's, you see, but
Yeah.
in the East, we can say that and we don't, it's not a critique against the council. It's just sort of a frank affirmation of looking at the history of the reception,
Yeah.
in especially the Latin circles. Like we can talk about the integralism stuff without anyone losing their minds, because again, there's no risk that you're going to have a bunch of Lefebvreism breakout, right? We can just
Yeah.
sort of try and read the council in continuity. So it's just such a different mind space. So whenever you
Wow.
get to these other
That's
people,
really, really interesting. That really makes a very interesting point about the difference approaches to many of the issues that swirl around the reception of the council, and how different that reception is through the lens of the East rather than through the lens of the West, because so many of the debates on my side of the aisle either tend towards you become a secularized liberal progressive, or you become like a Lefebvreite integralist. What,
yeah.
one of those
Whereas it
two.
just Yeah, there's just a certain distance from it where it's, I mean, figuring out like the position you're going to take about continuity and rupture, right, is a difficult thing. But no, there's just none of that temptation to just sort of go, you know, just completely one way or the other. You sort of sit with the ambiguous state that we're in right now and realize that you can kind of cling to the, the deepest
Yeah.
fibers of tradition that are both patristic and scriptural. I mean, that's the strength and the weakness of the East is that the kind of patristic ballast that's in the background is a ballast that kind of keeps
Yeah.
you, but that can sometimes get stuck, right? Like when you teach bioethics is a great example for that. Like it's really tough to just do a bioethics thing, based based on just patristic sources. As you know, for instance, a
Yeah.
lot of Orthodox churches, they're slipping on contraception because
There's
it's
nothing there.
human. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
There's no they if you just have the church fathers, you don't have that systematic
It's not systematic at least.
Thomistic development, and the whole line from Aquinas, and not just Aquinas. I mean, even folks like Bonaventure and others.
Yeah.
I mean, developing the natural law, moral theological tradition, which incorporates Aristotelian ideas and so on and so forth.
And then
Yeah,
the magisterium, just be frank, the magisterium's activity because the church is living and declares on these things, right?
yeah, that's right.
I mean, there is the I have deep love of the Orthodox churches, and like I said, I really would love to see reunion, right? Even if it was like a messy reunion, to be honest.
Yeah, me
But
too.
still, it's that there is a difference between having the complete living magisterium and having sort of this nebulous partial magisterium
Well,
thing.
this raised an interesting point too, about ecumenism, East and West,
Uh-huh.
East and West. I just go back and forth on this. I mean, obviously, I would love reunion with the East too. I think nothing could. Oh my goodness! I mean, you would agree. Nothing could be greater than to see a kind of rapprochement between the East and the West on some level. And yet, it's difficult. It's really, really difficult. And just drive that home just the other day. I don't know who was, somebody from the East and from the realm of Orthodoxy has suggested to Pope Francis to make this ecumenical gesture that Rome would start adopting the date for Easter that the East uses, and he said that would be a great ecumenical gesture. And I remember thinking, yeah, it would. And it would also be a great ecumenical gesture if you would simply accept the date established by Rome.
Yeah, yeah,
Because
I
after
know.
all, because
I
our
agree.
calendar is actually better than your calendar, by the
Yeah, I
way.
know. And I mean, one can claim about not wanting to fuss with it because of canons, but one-way street ecumenism becomes exhausting, which is that's what you have all your memory with is,
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely.
I mean, there's a lot of talking that some of it was very positive because you went through, there was an era like, in prior to the council, you had on, there was a Protestant minister who was on.
Paul Vanderklay.
Yeah. And just, he made you or he or both of you made the comment about how this conversation had been publicly would have been just non-existent, right?
Oh, it
So like
wouldn't
the
have.
fact we have the space for that is great, but at a certain point, all these public declarations just became the same circling, and then it just becomes, listen, I mean, the Roman Church has done quite a bit to walk in one direction. Like we need to
Yeah,
have some movement from the other side as well. Like, yeah,
yeah,
I do think that in the end, the Slavs and the Greeks they're going to have a lot of trouble on like Mount Athos, for instance. There's a lot of resistance to Rome, and that's
big.
either you rip the Band-Aid off and then just watch it happen and then let it settle out as it happens. I don't know, but
You know,
luckily, I mean,
the
it's not our jurisdiction, right? Like,
no, I mean, what I just try to let people know, I mean, the idea of some grand rapprochement between East and West is not going to happen. At best, what could happen be a reunification or intercommunion between Rome and some churches of the East, which would be a good thing in one sense, but also a bad thing in another because it would really fracture Orthodox. I mean, the Russians would never, ever, ever agree
yeah.
to rapprochement with Rome. And then, of course, there's that element associated with Mount Athos in Greek Orthodoxy that is such staunch saying no. The only true ecumenism is if the Romans give up their heresy. Uh, that kind of thing means that any reunification is going to be only partial.
Oh yeah, it's gonna be messy. It'll be some set of churches come into union, and then the question becomes how do the others relate to them?
Yeah, exactly.
But it would have to be whole churches, like because it would not be Uniatism again, like right. It would not be a
Right.
partial like what happened with like the constitution of all the Eastern Catholic
That's right.
churches. That's a model from the past that was, I mean, it's understandable, especially like, for the Ukrainians and Ruthenians, like we were sort of on the edge of Russia's attention, so we weren't even getting, good priestly formation or anything. So I mean, it makes sense why you'd come into union. Um, but yeah, but it's gonna be messy if it happens because it will be they come into union, a whole church set of churches come into communion. Do the Orthodox still recognize them as Orthodox? And then how does that change
Yeah.
the Roman relation? The Russians will be last. I mean, maybe this is because of I've become from a church that has a big Ukrainian basis. It's like you're not happy with the Russians. So,
I was discussing all this with a Greek Orthodox priest friend of mine a while ago, maybe like 15 years ago now. And I said something, well, the Russians would never come along with any of this. And he says, oh, blankety blank blank the Russians. He goes, we all hate the Russians.
yeah, just come, the rest of you, and then like let it happen.
Yeah, I think that was his point was, you know what? And yet then he said, and yet Russian Orthodoxy is by
It's
far and away the largest
the
element
largest, richest. It has too
of
much importance
Orthodox.
even culturally and
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
Orthodoxy. It is. I mean,
So,
so you can't, we can sort of like laugh about it, but I mean, you can't
yeah.
do.
So
Yeah, it's like
yeah,
they
he was
use.
laughing about the Russians, but then realizing no, we can't do without the Russians either.
Yeah,
We can't live with them,
exactly.
can't live without them. So at any rate, let's move on from that set of questions to you know I had on here Rod Dreer a couple weeks ago, interviewed him, and I was on the Matt Fradd show. I interviewed with pints with Aquinas, Matt Fradd, for like
Mhm.
3 hours almost at his studio. One of the last interviews at his old studio in Steubenville. That show will be airing in about a month. And the reason why I bring it up is I talked on that episode as well as with my interview with Rod Dreer about this issue, which is very near and dear to my soul. And it's really been kind of in the heart and soul of my blog for the past 5 years. It's the issue of enchantment and the issue of the mystical element of Christian existence. You know, Karl Rahner once famously said, "The Christian of the future will be a mystic, or he won't be at all." Um, and I think that's at least partly true. So, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, I don't know if you've read Rod Dreer's book or whatever, but
Yeah,
I know that you have
yeah,
thoughts on this,
yeah,
on the
I
re-enchanting.
skimmed it. Yeah, I got a copy of it. I skimmed it when it came. And in some ways, Rod's been sort of writing on this for years. Like even back
Yeah,
when he was over at the American Conservative. I mean, I think he openly said even while he was still over there that he was beginning the book. So there's a sense in which sort of the longer, kind of more in some ways probably more thought out version is online because then he writes his books tend to be written so that then it's more digestible to by a broader audience.
that's
He's an
right.
author he makes his primary money off that. So that's sort of the audience, how he has to filter his ideas for consumption that way. He's an interesting guy. I mean, there's a part of me I'm pained at the idea that someone left the Roman Church and didn't just become Eastern Catholic. but I also sort of understand. First of all, he's a big talking about another kind of big personality, and like the
Oh
experience of
yeah,
the crisis drove him to orthodoxy. But he has a way of putting his thumb on the pulse that's
he
like
does.
spooky. That's spooky. Um, yeah, and he's been talking about you and I had a little bit of a fiery back and forth, just brief online about Ian McGilchrist. Probably McGilchrist. I got his big 2 volume thing sitting here on my desk.
Master and the
Um,
emissary.
well, that's the small one. That's the 500 page one. He has this 1,500 page
Oh,
behemoth
that's right. I
in
don't
two
have that
volumes.
one.
Yeah, so I yeah, ordered them both. But and then I've been thinking about the modernist crisis a bit more. Surprise, surprise, right? The Gary LaCrunch guy. But no, I had to do a an essay for Nova et Vetera, in which I actually tried to be charitable, like to George Terrell. It was a weird essay too because I had I ended up,
Ooh,
disagreeing with that, critiquing George Terrell, but it ended up creating certain critiques of Ambrose Gardet, who's very dear to me, Father Ambrose Gardet, a Dominican,
yeah.
one of Garrigue's masters. And
And
I'm thinking about these issues
let me
about
just
reverence.
interrupt you for a second. I'd
Yeah,
love to. I mean, I don't subscribe to Nova Vetera, but I wouldn't mind getting a hold of that article because I'm currently writing a book on modernism.
yeah.
Uh,
I'll send
and
it to you. It's interesting actually. I'll send it to you only because I spent a lot of time reading like the kind of denouement books of his, the stuff that's like at the end. He did a lot of essays
yeah.
over the years. But it's so floating around in my mind are all these issues about how to understand the epistemological structure of revelation, right? Because this, the whole kind of idea of prophetic versus theological truth that's present in Terrell, he wants to drive. It's interesting. He wants to drive a hard wedge between the dogmatic people. Here's sort of the cheapy neo-scholastic way of thinking of Terrell and others, which is maybe more
Loisy.
Loisy, Sabatier, others is, when it comes to Revelation, it's basically there's religious sentiment, it burbles up, and then we get our poetic schemas that we, or whatever,
Yeah.
our symbolic schemas that we use, and there are, versions depending on someone's mood. They attribute this to some of Ronner's theories of Revelation, if they want to sort of accuse him of modernism, and it sort of stops there. I mean, you just kind of stop there. It's at the level of kind of how Pascendi presents it. And that's basically in a viewed from a distance is not totally incorrect. But when you start to dig in, Terrell is basically completely against the idea of dogmatic development because he holds that, basically in the end, the prophetic nature of the church's proposal of truths is basically distorted whenever you start reading scientific theology into kind of like the noetic of
Oh
how
wow, it's
faith
interesting. Yeah.
operates. It's
Yeah.
weird because on one hand, he has this kind of like it's like almost primitivism. It really is. I was reading something about Abe Nichols on this, and it sort of like it showed me that I needed to go back and like really engage with him and not just sort of filter him through what I've known.
So his
Um,
point would be that you know what, it has the original prophetic insight and it just doesn't translate into.
that's it. So then, because he's spooked then because of the historical stuff that's going on, both around scripture and also
Yeah.
just some of the things throughout the tradition. So he wants to basically push a kind of complete heterogeneity then between
Interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
theological thought. I mean, he calls it theologism. And then, the critique is though what's left. So it's his position is an anti-propositionalist position. So in some ways, depending on his mood early on before he becomes more abrasive after he gets excommunicated. I mean, I think God was merciful because he died 2 years after he's excommunicated.
Yeah, he
I
did.
think God was really merciful. I think that was the way of perhaps we may see him on the other side. He may have had a long stay off in purgatory, but I'm not
Yeah.
unconvinced. I was struck by this is gonna sound crazy. I was struck as a fellow Christian by what I think was a pastor who was spooked by like, how do you deal with what's going on just with all the changes over the past 100 years?
Yeah.
Um, he tries to basically defend himself somewhat the way that like I'm sure whenever you were doing your formation, like the Yale School stuff that you get out of
Well, yeah, Lindbeck and
yeah.
Reverend Childs and guys like this, the
Yeah, now
very
that's different. It's like historically different because it comes out of like the angles.
Wittgenstein.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
very
So
Wittgensteinian, and it's more along the lines of the linguistic
yeah.
paradigm
But
shifts and so forth. But never,
exactly. But the
doctrines has
pragmatism,
grammar,
but that
but it's
pragmatism that's present there,
yeah,
that's in him too. And he's parrying against that, right? Because he's basically that is the thing that's in the background. Because they try to accuse Blondel of this too, and so he's parrying against it. I mean, that's interesting too because Blondell's actually very influential on him. Now, I think that he probably This is weird. This is I feel like I'm unpacking Terrell in a way I didn't expect to today. Because Terrell's interesting. You can't really say he didn't understand Blondel, although he admitted, because you know what it's like to read Blondel, he's really difficult. Right? The French say that. The French make that point.
Oh, I talked to my colleague Rodney Hauser, who just waded through
Oh, L'Action.
most of Blondel. Yeah, L'Action.
Oh,
Yeah,
just went through
he
all of
did
it.
a
Yeah.
course. He did a course with. He studied Blondel on a course with Marco Stango, a philosopher,
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah.
Marco was teaching the course, and Rodney says, "I want to learn more about Blondel," and basically Rodney couldn't do any podcast with me for a whole semester because he was bogged down in L'Action. He says, "Man,
L'Action et
that is the
Pensée.
hardest damn book to read on the face of the earth," and I
Uh,
can attest to that.
Yeah, and so Terrell, and so, but it's, I don't mean that as a kind of like slight on his intelligence or his training, because he's really, it's just, he dove into Thomism like feet first at the beginning. He actually got kicked out of his seminary he was teaching at because he wasn't being a Soresian. Terrell.
Oh wow.
Yeah, because I forget where it was in
Well,
Ireland.
what aspect of the Suarezism didn't he like? Was it
I know he was
Suarez's propositionalism, perhaps?
that I'm not see that I don't know. I probably have to go into his letters more than I did. I just know it as a fact. I think he was also just trying to be a he's sort of taking Leo the 13th on his letter or on his word.
Yeah,
But then he
yeah.
reads Blondel and it begins to change in his mind. And I think he starts getting because von Hugel is sending him people like I think even someone's daughter, maybe even von Hugel's daughter, I forget. But von
I
Hugel
think it
starts sending
was.
him people who are having crises of faith, and others are coming to him as well. Because that's what leads to the big blow up is that some professor writes him, and he writes this letter where he basically he attenuates his vocabulary to talk to the person he's writing to. And so his claims are, if you read them at face value, they can seem like a little over the top. But then it gets publicly manifested, and that's how everything unfolds. Is basically people say, look at what he's saying in private. But anyway, I mean, it's just interesting because it's this issue of, and this is connected to the point. Like this is not just minor meander into another topic that's his, because I want to keep us on this. This issue of like, it's propositionalism. What's propositionalism and Revelation? How does it relate to the practices of Christianity? How does mystical grammar relate to the data of faith, right? The language of the mystics, how does
Yeah,
that relate
yeah,
to the language of faith? I mean, heck, even Garrigou-Lagrange makes the point in an essay in The Three Ages. He says the vocabulary of the mystics, because it's founded on a higher kind of knowledge, is a higher vocabulary than the scholastic theologian. Okay, that's fine, but like let's admit that trying to get that to live next door to basically a renient propositionalism, a renient concern for,
yeah,
dogma that has actual content, right? That has articulable content, that has a kind of homogeneity of sorts with reason and also with just the notions that are used in dogmas. How do you make those two live next to each other? I think we're just living because of the problems of modernity in general, right? The issues with reason, a kind of cramped view of reason, that we're going through the crisis of a long arc that's trying to deal with all this.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my
So
goodness.
it's like Terrell is like a central thing for like as I'm thinking about what I'm hearing from Dreer and I'm thinking about what we were talking about with
Yeah.
McGilchrist.
Well, what it points to, yeah, especially with McGilchrist and others like it, is that uh, you have to maintain the Catholic both and here because it's absolutely true that okay, a certain arid, let's put it this, arid propositionalism. That was a common phrase. It's so arid, it's dry, it's desiccated. What they mean is, therefore, is a propositionalism that has been somewhat isolated from the liturgical life and mystical
Mhm.
life and spiritual life of the church, just kind of free floating on an intellectual way. Okay, all true, fine. That's a certain caricature, but there's also certain truth to it. Then, okay, the alternative is not to simply then reduce theology to enchantment, to reduce it to simply the poetic, the lyrical, the numinal, the mystical, and therefore to have no patience for close work. This is key. A lot of people that I know are very, very smitten with theologies that are contemplative, lyrical, poetic, and all that kind of stuff, but they're turned off by theologies that require meticulous, close work.
Mhm.
And I think that's an important thing to maintain as we, in other words, the enchantment has got, for a Catholic, has got to come through the truths of the dogmas and
Yeah.
not around them or in spite of them.
Yeah, I forget. There's a header in a book, little book by Journet, I use like a section header, like as an expression to capture something. It's called the English. It's the dark knowledge of God.
Yeah.
Uh, I think it's knowledge and unknowledge in God is what it is in the French, but or non-knowing in God or no, knowledge of God. But he makes a point about how mystical experience, it aims beyond concepts, but never without them. And here's how I tell people this: it's like you never can kick the creed out from underneath you, at
That's
least here
right.
below, right?
That's
In the
true.
vision of God, we'll know God immediately. And so you don't have, I mean, you won't have the same mediation of like the mystery won't be now broken up across dogmas and doctrines, right? Like we won't have to have all of this sort of the complexity of what life is in
Yeah.
this state. But right now, that's, all of that formulated truth is the highway of mysticism. It's not something, you can't, another way to put it in more Christological terms, you can't kick the sacred humanity of Christ out from underneath you.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
You really can't. And that's the key. That's the difference. The incarnation.
Yeah.
As I said, I think it was in my last interview with Caitlin Smith Gilson, you know, there's certainly a time for the apophatic moment in our thinking. Si comprehendis non est Deus,
Mhm.
and all of that. That's all very, very true. And therefore, you don't want to simply reduce revelation to a set of propositions. That the mystery is always beyond that. On the other hand, in Catholicism, the apophatic moment has to be just that, a moment within a broader cataphatic tradition of positive truth. As Balthasar says, we are not blinded by ignorance and darkness, we're blinded by an excess of light.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and so truth, I mean, Ratzinger was so good on this. We cannot abandon the concept of God's truth revealed to us in Christ. We simply can't.
Yeah, I mean that's just I mean it's such at the heart of Christianity. I mean, some people I've gone through my era with this too, the Regensburg Address. You remember it happened, everyone talked about it. Then you
Yeah,
go through a period, then you're like, oh, everyone's talking about it. Then I start teaching it again for a class I'm doing, and I'm like, no, this captures something that's like just really like at the level of a fundamental principle that you gotta say that we're a religion of logos, and we're a religion of manifestation. And theophany is not, I mean, theophany is not just proposition, but it is the manifestation of truth. And part of the manifestation of truth, both in knowing, like the knowing that's quote unquote speculative or theoretic, and practical too, is measured by ideas. But like just like you said, keep the both and, right? That
yeah, yeah.
the deposit is a mixture of those truths which are declared and which are lived, right? In the liturgy. And I mean, whatever. I mean, there's a line that Blondel has that sometimes the Thomists critique, but it says that sort of a revelation without kind of an ascetical mystical effectively carry on doesn't make sense. And the Thomists sort of critique it because I'm not even, to be honest, I'm not sure why they do in this case. I understand other reasons they may critique Blondel and Nature and Grace. We can, what I mean? That's open
Yeah.
season. But on this point, the truths, like the truths of faith are both speculative and practical. They're both at once because God's knowledge is at once knowledge of his triune self and the knowledge of the economy of
That's
salvation.
right. That's
There are
right.
these wonderful texts where actually Cajetan hits on this in Thomas Aquinas, where most Thomists talk about how theology is primarily speculative, which they basically just say it really is just speculative. But like Cajetan sees in the treatment of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and even in that first question, the Summa Theologiae, he says it's both. It's somehow both because that's what it's like for God. So the truths we're talking about are truths about reality, and they're the truths of our life because that all of God's knowledge, God's own knowledge of
Yeah.
self as Trinity and of the redemptive, well, the saving, redemptive, divinizing economy of salvation is both at once. So the
That's
truth,
true.
life, praxis, all of it should actually be together, and there's no reason to fall into a kind of
Absolutely.
pragmatism
And all of
on
those,
the other side. It's not pragmatism to make that point. Like I would like to shake my fellow Thomists and say that sometimes. I really would. I'm not saying this just for your
yeah,
sake. Like I am actually willing to critique my side because it's sort of like it's like family. I don't want other people critiquing my family, right? But it's like,
but I can.
Bill, and I don't have an Uncle Bill, but it's like Uncle Bill's a bit
That's
of a
right.
he's a bit of
Oh,
a
I'm
pain.
the same
I
way.
can say it.
Yeah, I'm the same way. When other people, for example, criticize De Lubac or Balthazar or Ratzinger or JB2 or Daniel Lu or Guardini and these my heroes, I get I bristle. But I'm certainly capable of then with my fellow communio buddies saying, you know what? Ratzinger really missed the boat on this point, and
Yeah,
yeah, I
but don't
think
worry about
Daniel
it.
Liu was kind of all wet on this thing. Yeah,
But
absolutely.
but
You
anyway,
can
that's
critique.
I'm being genuine. I'm not just doing this to like play to my
No,
audience.
that's true.
Like,
That's
because I
true.
really would like shake them on this. Like that the the practical has to be important because the truths of faith measure charity, and charity perfects faith in the gifts of the Holy Spirit, according to the theology of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, mysticism, the divine indwelling, all of the best stuff you get out of someone like John of St. Thomas, Gardet, Garrigou, Aaron Terra, all of them. Like this is super important. You have to see this way that the truths of
Yeah.
faith flower in charity. Sorry. Okay. Anyway,
John
it's
of
not a
Saint
good practice thing.
Man,
That's
you
all
brought
I'm
up
saying.
John of Saint Thomas. I haven't thought of John of Saint Thomas in a long time. That's certainly somebody worth revisiting because I focus so much on Lagrange. But yeah. Anyway, I want to get back to the enchantment then question. Okay, all those
Yeah. So you see,
caveats.
this is like the level of principles on enchantment. So now, like, let's keep me from
That's
yeah.
right. Okay, so we've sort of laid the groundwork for the fact that we're not talking about new agey BS. We're talking about a genuine Christian sense of enchantment, and I'm just wondering out loud here, off the top of my head, what can what can the church do to, in a sense, help in the re-enchantment of the world? Let me throw something out here. Just once again, throw you a curveball. I have a lot of friends right now who are very, very smitten with all of these drones that are flying over New Jersey and New York and the whole UFO, UAP, whatever you want to call phenomenon, and the enemy stuff. And there's going to be disclosure very soon. Blah blah blah. And I don't know what people think about one or the other. But my thinking on it is this: is that to a great extent, what's interesting is it's the bearing out of Chesterton's old adage that when people stop to believe in God, it's not that they now believe in nothing, it's now that they'll believe in anything. And he didn't mean by that necessarily something disparaging, like they'll believe anything stupid. What he means is that the human religious impulse is such that we will seek out substitutes. So when a proper enchantment goes away, when the Christian enchantment is attenuated and begins to sink, other enchantments rise up to take it. And I view the entire obsession that some of my friends seem to have with this UFO thing as a kind of thirsting after. They're looking for being. They're desiring being, and there's therefore seeking some kind of enchantment. And this is a way of re-enchanting the world. Instead of seeing wee people and little banshees and fairies around every, they're seeing little the grays. I saw one of the grays. Like, okay, I don't know how that's much different than a fairy behind a tree, but it's the modern sci-fi Star Trek version of the mythopoesis of wee people, if you ask me.
hmm
But it's all
hmm
an attempt at re-enchantment, it seems.
Yeah. I think you're completely right. Yeah, it's like that you brought it up, but that book by McCarrer, The Enchantments of Mammon. It's
Oh
like
yeah.
I've only flipped through because it's such a big book. It's like so many books that I own. You probably know what this is like, but it's true. It's like you'll just go seeking, you're seeking enchantment no matter where you're at. I mean, you are. And I've thought this about the UFO thing. My students joke with me at the Byzantine seminary. They say, "You're too online, Dr. Minard," because I'll say what I've seen on Twitter and whatnot. But I've been thinking
Yeah.
exactly the same thing. And
Yeah.
Rod himself is sort of engaging in it because he's close to Cale Zeldin, and this
Well,
is sort of
yeah.
going on. And
And
I don't want
Kale,
to
I
just like
saw Kale had a whole hour-long live show, hour and a half with Steve Skojek, who I love.
yeah,
I love Steve
yeah,
Skojek.
yeah. And it's
Steve's a
like
great guy, but I just remember I was watching the whole thing and I was a little bit Skojek clearly trends towards, well, they're probably aliens. And
yeah.
I'm thinking, well, I don't know. I
But
don't know.
you probably, and I'm not saying this about age, even though I did think that at one time, if you remember, I thought you voted for Kennedy. I don't know why, because I'm forgetting the two generations. I said that to you online once, and you said, "How old do you think I am?" Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but you've seen enough of these kind of things that it makes
Yeah.
you put the pause on. But at the level of like what you're saying here, I do think I really wish, especially our fellow Christians, and I'm not trying to lecture Kale or Steve's got I mean he's got his own path ever since his experiences with the church and
Well, I
tradition.
think Kale's view, I think Kale's open to all kinds of, and so is Steve. I just
Yeah,
think Steve trends towards the alien explanation, but he's
yeah,
not dogmatic
but
about
I
it.
guess
Not at
I don't, and maybe this is just a kind of pragmatism in me. Like, I don't know. This is the Slav half of me. It's just like just do it. Pay attention to your duties closer to home. that this is filling a void for something else. Exact same thing that you said.
Yeah.
And I'm not judging them for that. I'm being very clear if they're listening. That is not me saying it because
Me either.
there's a breadth here that since I'm not as interested in it, so I'm just it's going to happen either way.
Yeah.
I'm having enough trouble, like, as a tired parent, like just entering into the liturgical mystery, like with enough attention right now. But I
Yeah.
think I think is right. I think you're right that it's an example of like how this happens. And it'll happen in other ways. There's a way that you could see all the LGBT stuff as
Yeah.
being it's
Yeah.
looking for the new, the different. I mean, coming out is a kind of manifestation, right? I mean, you're just looking
Yes.
for the experience, right? I mean, sometimes it's that simple, that cheap is basically what that's like that's the Cheetos version of looking for enchantment. It's sort of the experience of the crowd, being part of the
Yeah.
crowd, what that is.
Yeah.
Um, and this is why, I mean, the simple
And a
answer is
feeling of being part of something bigger than yourself. So,
that's it. That brings us back to
okay,
the beginning.
I'm
That's
I'm a
why I'm
dude. I'm a dude. I'm attracted to other dudes. So like a lot of people that are attracted to other dudes. But now all of a sudden, it's not just me having certain sexual predilections. Now it's me part of this grand project,
yeah.
called LGBTQ plus IA.
Yeah.
I'm part of something huge now.
Yeah, and this brings us back the idea of being part of something. I think like deep at
Yeah,
what's bothering me this time of year when I think about like the Christmas that's not like my Christmas of yore, that rootedness in the experience of this little t tradition of how we celebrate the holidays was a way of incarnating in a way that's close to home because that's actually where your duties are, right?
that's
Your
right.
duties are in the negotiating of the virtues, all of them in your own life. You're keyed into the bigger narrative of salvation history through this little tiny vine of it that reached the Rust Belt in Western Pennsylvania, and but the practices of like a decent liturgical community, you have an entree into the thing that's bigger than yourself, right?
Yeah,
And that's why in the end I don't like to sound like I feel like this is like maybe it's me working at home all the time talking to myself. I feel like I'm saying this all the time, but it's a real sense in which fixing the liturgy fixes a lot of things. And I'm not even saying about, I mean, you do have to fix all the banalities of liturgy. You really do.
do.
Um, but you need a culture that gives you a sense that you're grounded in something that is it's the bigger action of Christ's presence in his mysteries in the liturgy. And this is not just a question of it being pretty, because guess what? I'm in the lowest church of the Byzantines, but you can still have that sense, like if it's done right, and if it's done in a way that's
That's right.
human, that's rooted. And I don't know how we fix this idea of it being rooted, because we're living through an era where the church is sort of drawn back for as much as
Yeah,
I'm going to cast aspersions in all directions, but as much as traditionalist communities want to say, "Oh, we're the ones who are growing," one parish in a 50-some mile radius that
yeah.
draws a lot of people isn't it's good, it's something positive, but it's not.
It's a
It's
niche market.
it's a niche market in the midst of a church that is
Yeah,
just drawing back immensely. So how we get to that point of like grounded
yeah,
practices of a faith community that you encounter the other just by being born into the situation you're in. I mean, I'm an ex-Benedictine. One of the vows for Benedictines is stability.
yeah. That's right.
And the idea of stability that it's like family in a sense, right? You're born here. You're born into this community, this tradition of Catholicism, which is this tradition of Christ's mysteries active and present in the contingencies of now. How to have that. That's what people are wanting because we're like floating
Yeah.
on top of the sea of self-defined, autonomous agent individual modernity, right? And we're conflicted. We want something more, but you can't make up a tradition. You can't just
Oh,
make it
this is key.
up.
This is key. I mean, I'm a Benedictine oblate, so is my wife. I
Okay.
get the thing about stability and so on, but this is key. I sometimes use the analogy with Paul Tillich, where Paul Tillich made the distinction between broken and unbroken myths,
Mhm.
and Tillich makes the point that one of the problems with modernity is that we've broken myths, and once you've broken a myth, you can't recover them, and the myth is now broken. For a myth to be truly, to grab your mythopoetic imagination, it has to in a sense be there. So you can try this sort of second naivete sort of approach to things that rarely works once the myth is broken. And I feel the same way about tradition, that once a tradition is severed from its cultural roots and once it's been dead for a long time, there's a certain ersatz quality to try to resurrect the darn thing and say it's like it's a festivus miracle. Just like
Yeah.
you know and that's what was the genius of that Seinfeld episode about
Mhm.
Festivus was
Mhm.
the ludicrousness of it is that you don't make up a holiday like that. A made up holiday is almost by definition absurd
Yeah.
on the face of it. It's not really a holiday at all. And of course, for George Costanza's family, it was simply a symbolic expression of their complete dysfunction, as a family. And so, yeah, that's my thinking about the attempt to. But is this not then this is the conundrum we face, Matthew?
Yeah,
Right?
this is the absolute conundrum we face. Yeah, because that's what happens in like so in the East, people read themselves into the East, either into the Eastern Catholic churches or into Orthodoxy. But of course, they've read themselves. It's like watching a bunch of American people from like Denton or you're from where in the
Lincoln, Lincoln,
from Lincoln,
Lincoln.
like a bunch of Midwesterners from Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'm just using that as an example to get a nice stereotype here, like white as white bread can be, reading
Yeah,
themselves in to, like Slavophilia or Grecophilia, right? And sort of creating an idea for what they think orthodoxy is. And you do the same thing with trads. We all do this. I mean, I do it to a degree because I at least grew up with some of the Slovak Catholicism. But I'm the guy who switched rights, and I'm the one who's always pushing the Rusin on people, like because I want the old Bubba's music to be sung. But we
yeah,
all do this where we try and recreate something that isn't ours. And it's like I feel my stepdad. He always used to say, he says, I hate that kind of inauthenticity. So I'm claiming it
yeah,
on myself as well. And yet that's what kind of what back up. What other reaction could you have? And this is not about the
yeah,
council actually, because like back yourself up through the experience of like whatever period, if it's World War One or the 20s. It's like World War One in the 20s, it's all starting. The Depression just puts it all on halt. And then it's across the globe. I mean, by the time that you're then into the 40s and 50s,
yeah,
there is just this leveling that wants to happen in so many of the developed cultures. Um,
yeah.
and I don't have a big narrative for it, right? You know what I mean? I'm not going to do a narrative that's like post-war and people trying to avoid the trauma of the war. I don't know because it's a logic that's inherent in liberalism. It absolutely is, but I don't want to go down like it's just one big, deterministic march of history through liberalism, and this is what liberalism does, eating things up. But it does do that.
That's
Like,
exactly
I
what
mean,
it does. That's the
yeah,
problem. What do you do when old cultural forms are dead? I mean, whenever in the history, this, in some sense, it's not new. In the history of the church, you've seen the church go through various historical periods where one culture sort of fades away and another replaces it. And then the church adopts, in a sense, transposes the older form into the new, and changes are made and so forth. That was all done, though, however, in an era when one culture confronted another, it was confronting another true culture. We don't have a true culture. That's the point here. That liberalism has created a situation in which we have an anti-culture. We are
yeah,
acultural. We are
yeah.
opposed to cultures. In fact, I mean, I mentioned this before. You get an absolutely horrific, awful, terrible song like John Lennon's "Imagine," which is the anthem of our age, which essentially says if we just didn't give a shit about anything and didn't have anything that we aspired to bigger than ourselves, whether it's nation or race or the strong gods, but that also he says, imagine there's no heaven, or and all that sort of stuff. So in other words, the great leveling. That song is the anthem of the great leveling, the great metaphysical flatlining. And how do you develop new liturgical expressions, cultural holiday expressions out of a culture that is not a culture? That's the problem we
No,
face.
and not let it be just another liberal lifestyle choice, because
That's
that's what
right.
the temptation is that it's that. That's exactly
Bingo. You
because
nailed it. That it's not just an
the
accessory like
yeah.
everything else.
Yeah, it's just that it's the because we want something that we want a tradition that's chosen us in the sense that Providence has chosen us. This is again the
Oh gosh, that is such a
right?
great way to put it, Matthew.
And
I'm going to
instead of
steal that
choosing,
with attribution. With
yeah, well, no,
attribution.
that's it came, and it's just come to my mind as I'm saying because instead of because I'm flipping it right because we liberalism
Yes.
wants to make the only thing that is an acceptable law the autonomous agent's law self-imposed on themselves. And no, what we want is because when we say we want a tradition that's chosen us, that's not just like glorifying tradition. It's like saying we want to be slotted into providence is what we want.
Yeah.
That's what our heart desires as creatures, as finite creatures. Like it's probably deeply metaphysically just structured all throughout us as created beings because
Yeah.
to be created is to be measured by, we can be very like 13th century by the divine ideas. Like we are measured by the eternal law, as one would say. I mean, which means
Oh,
provident,
yeah.
the providential placement of me here. And like you, Larry Chapp, me, everyone. And I mean, there's a lot of tragedy this thing involves too. So we could, go there, but that's we're placed where we are because it's willed by God, and we want to
God
find
wants us to
work
be
our way
where
out.
we are.
Yeah, like He wants us. That's it. Like there are things that we are supposed to accomplish as part of providence that we will look before Him, and a lot of it we're gonna have to say, Lord, I screwed up, but it was a
Yeah.
real blessing that
I,
every
I,
good that you did give me. But anyway,
but
sorry.
knowing that though, that I mean, God wants us to be where we are here and now, and knowing too that human beings are inherently social and religious animals, and knowing too that as degraded as our culture is, and it is degraded and is in many ways an anti-culture, we cannot live without culture, and there is some culture here.
Mhm.
There is a little tiny burning ember of culture still there. And perhaps it's our task as Christians in today's world to be the keeper of that little tiny ember,
Yeah,
however much we try. Yes, we're so prone to role playing, right? Because
yeah,
for us, it's
LARPing.
it's in our it's in our DNA to just view things therapeutically and consumeristically. So, oh, okay, I'm Ruthenian Rite Catholic now, or I'm a TLM Mass Catholic. So you adopt this conscious role playing of, okay, I'm going to wear tweed jacket, smoke a pipe, and my wife is going to wear dresses down to her ankles and all
Yeah,
this kind of stuff,
yeah,
and
or
I'm going to
babushkas and whatever. You
yeah,
know what I mean? Yeah.
yeah. So it's all this sort of conscious role playing, and okay, fine. It's a sort of mimesis, I guess.
Yeah, it's like no,
Uh,
there's a bit of that you'll never you'll condemn all of humanity if you try to root that out, right? Because that's each of
yeah,
us are a mixture of the
yeah.
wheat
So
and the
I look
weeds
at
right
that
there.
and I say, okay, yeah,
But it's
whatever.
like the core of it should be the wheat that best be primary in that field amid all that live action role playing, that LARPing. Um, should be though the idea of being rooted in the place that you're at, fulfilling
That's right.
whatever happens to be
That's
from the
right.
circumstances of your life. Like it's not here, you did just like you got your Seinfeld in. I'll get a Star Trek reference.
Oh,
There's
I
this
love
line,
Star Trek.
the guy who Zephram Cochrane, the guy who invents
Oh yeah,
the warp
he invented the
engine.
warp drive.
Yeah, there's a line in the movie that was from the Next Generation where he says, "Don't try to be a great man, just be a man, and let history make its judgment." Now, he's kind of a drunk at the time, and so Riker tells me,
Yeah,
he's like, "Who said that garbage?" And Riker says, "You did 20 years from now," because it's a whole time travel thing going on. But there's a
yeah,
sense, don't try to be part of the big narrative of saving civilization, or don't talk about reenchantment. Like being like
yeah.
you experience reenchantment by substantively living, if you're going to be a good Orthodox or Catholic, substantively living a rooted ecclesial life in the broadest sense of ecclesia,
That's
the
right.
ecclesia of the church herself as a whole, and the domestic church
Yeah,
as a married couple.
I agree, and paying attention to elemental things. I mean, one of the to go down a different rabbit hole, one of the things that drives me blankety blank crazy, and I saw this even in Rome. You walk into a church, and they have electric votive lights. You know what? I just want to take a hand grenade, and
I
of
know.
course, I should not say this, otherwise YouTube might not post this. But
Oh.
I hate them
You
because
just you want to go and you want to flip the breaker is what you want
yeah,
to do.
because a flickering electric light made to imitate a flame is not a flame.
No.
There's an elemental quality to like my church actually has real votive candles.
Yeah.
There's an elemental quality to that, and you could come up with examples, but there are sort of existential equivalents of that in our lives as well. What I'm driving at is part of the problem that we face is our slavery to technology, slavery to our iPhones, slavery to our iPads, constantly on every app, on social media and so forth. And that's all well and good. Look, I'm on this medium right now
Yeah.
doing
Exactly.
this, and we have to get along, but we need an ascesis. There has to be an ascetical moment here, I think, in the lives of modern Christians in order to, in a sense, truly attempt some kind of re-enchantment. We have to lose our pseudo enchantments. We used to call this in the spiritual life, we need to learn detachment from
Hmm.
idolatries and sins. Well, let's talk about our attachments to pseudo enchantments and
Yeah.
attempt to, in a sense, dial it back to retrieve in our family lives with our children, our spouses, certain elemental things. Something is sitting around the dinner table and talking to one another, turning off the television at night to play a stupid game of Monopoly or something.
Yeah.
These are elemental experiences.
Yeah. No, and I think so it's like here's the too simplistic way of doing it, and then we'll go more specific. Stop living mediated through techne, which is the
Yeah.
domain that we have power over. Now, the problem is, guess what? There's not just nature and art that are totally separate because our nature is to be cultural, like our
Yes.
cognition, our morality, right? So that means you can't live unmediatedly, right? It's just
No, you
obvious.
have to. It's
But
obvious.
what you need to
Yes.
do is you need to get back to a place where, like, the meal, for instance, is as little mediation as possible, where it's at the human scale,
Yes.
right? Where it's really at the human scale where nature, like the human condition, which is really, shot through with God's activity of grace, right? Because that's where the theophany then will occur, right? Is
Yes.
that your this entire every single action is just bathed. Like we've never known a state of nature, right? I mean, you and I are going to agree on that statement, right? Which means that all throughout the agency that we operate is the supernatural, but you have to be at the point where nature is budding forth into human action instead of in sort of the sedimented using of technology,
That's
right? Because
right.
that's what the temptation is for the modern man. It's just mastery after mastery after mastery and engaging with the tools of mastery. And you got to be, like you said, like you have to be,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's just
Control.
another way. I'm trying to just re-articulate it in my
No,
language.
see, the power of techne is the power of control,
Yeah,
and by a certain extension, the power of acquisition, to
yeah.
acquire, to control. And this is what techne does it beautifully, the technological paradigm.
that
Now look
that
at you.
that's that wall behind me, right? Why is that there? The workers, they had to take a beam out above, and so it's a temporary wall. It was holding it. It actually could be taken out now. But like, yeah, it controls, and I am sure I am sure as hell glad that it was controlling my
That's right.
roof, right?
Yeah.
Or my ceiling.
Yeah. And
But
like,
it's the
I
logic of
would,
it is Bacon, Descartes, right? It's
yeah,
the myth that has been replaced, the myth that has replaced the mythos of a certain kind of Christian order. Again, we
yeah.
can't go making up a new Christendom or something. I mean, heaven knows.
No,
But to
you
do,
can't.
but it was the myth that replaced it was the myth of being a master and possessor of nature. And boy, we don't realize how that insinuates itself everywhere.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
the LGBT stuff. It's
Uh,
just one more version of that. It's the things I choose.
oh,
I
gosh.
don't, I don't have it's like, a pre-bond of family, a place of etc. is not what's primary. It's what I choose. That's just one more version of this.
Oh,
Sorry.
it is. Hang on a second.
Yeah. Here, I'll fill time as
No,
Larry.
no.
I'll describe it to
I'm
the
I'm
podcast.
very
Oh, there he is.
smitten
He's
right
back.
now. Speaking of this, speaking of, I thought of it. We're talking about the modern technological paradigm and control and power. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, another very thick book by Peter Harrison, Some New World.
No,
Myths of Supernatural Belief in a Secular Age. I want to get
no.
this guy. He's in Australia. People are raving about this book,
You
Some
might
New
have
World.
mentioned it though. I remember you
Peter
mentioning it.
Harrison, Myths of Supernatural Belief in a Secular Age. Well, what he points out in this book, and of course, now we could get back into our old nature and grace debates. What he points out is that the very notion of a kind of the supernatural vis-a-vis the natural, and the supernatural sort of existing up here and the natural down here, with a sort of divide between the two, is an extremely false view, and it is grounded in a mythology of the modern world, that it is utterly unchristian to think in those kinds of categories.
Yeah, and of course, I'm gonna not even as a Thomist. I mean, you can find because the Orthodox went through this. Boy, there's some Orthodox that are listening to lose their mind if I'm saying this, but when the Palamite controversy happened, they had
Yeah.
to start parsing nature, the what belongs to the nature of things. Like basically, what do you do with demons if demons are in hell? There's something left. Is because that's actually a classic example in Aquinas, and Palamas even uses it.
Yeah.
But it's clear if you read the thing that came out of Athos defending Palamas that this is their version of dealing with. the nature grace stuff. This is how it popped out. So there's a
Yeah.
sense in which you got to make these distinctions because you have to have some ontological solidity, which is participation in the Trinitarian life, and then what is not that formally, right? What is not
Yeah.
beatified. But that aside, I get it. It's a very modern, you're right, that the reason that
Yeah.
this, even if it's present in the scholastics of the Middle Ages, it's very present. Nonetheless, that kind of two-tierism, it hardens in the modern period. And I don't think it's merely because of intrascholastic things. I think it's something that's the logic of modernity of a kind. And I don't know how to put my finger on it. So this
Yeah.
is an interesting point.
Well, I mean, it's so fascinating because there is a sense, I mean, C.S. Lewis points this out, that Christianity is a sort of inherently dualistic religion. I mean, we're not monists, either
Yeah.
spiritual or material monists. Christians do adhere, and going all the way back to the scriptures, the church fathers, the scholastics, who believe that there's spirit and there's matter. They're not reducible to what, they're not the same thing. They're not reducible to one another. They represent two sort of different principles, uh, and yet Christian incarnationalism does something radically different with that spirit, matter, nature,
Yeah.
grace thing. I
Yeah.
mean, which you can either go the Manichaean right, the route, the anti-cosmic dualism,
Mhm.
the divided line, all that kind of stuff, or you end up as someone like a David Bentley Hart seems lately these days in a spiritual monism of some
Monism.
kind.
Yeah.
You know,
But no, I think, I mean, because if the deepest part of our soul as spiritual beings is, to use our jargon for is Thomas, is our obediential potency, is
yeah,
our openness to grace, which is not just kind of like an infinite plasticity for God to just do whatever the heck he wants. Like the deepest part of us as spiritual beings is fulfilled by the vision of God. If that's down at the root of the substance of our soul, that affects everything else too, though. That means that everything else that's going on the natural level is profoundly dependent on the supernatural order in the end, because it's like nature was made for grace, was made for glory, right?
yes,
Which those each of those
yes,
are important. Like it's a single order. The later Thomists got better about saying that. I think it's like Garrigou tries to read it into Cajetan, but it's in Jean-Baptiste Gonet, where Gonet says, let's stop talking about like how God had all these decrees in order. I mean, I'm sure he deals with that a bit in his stuff about predestination, but he says the model you got to think of here is like a house. It's not like an architect thinks about the foundation first and this or that. There's this single end, and the other pieces are viewed in view of that end. And so that means nature is for the sake of being grace, which is for the sake of the hypostatic union, which is for the sake of the glory of God. Okay, well then that means you need to really think through what are the implications of that then for nature. And it's so
yeah,
tempting. Listen, here's what Thomists do at the level of moral theology. I can say this, because I teach moral theology. There's a real temptation to turn everything in, and I'm not anti-natural law, but to turn everything into the natural law, even though you're the one school, Soresians too, but you're the school that held that there are infused moral virtues, right? So you've got this idea of Christian moral virtue, and yet you totally miss the way that the supernatural elevates the moral life. And there's this real focus,
yeah.
for apologetic reasons, I don't know what, but on just natural law. And that's because it's like living in a world of like two different providences of like
And
this.
yeah, it is, and gosh, we could talk about this for hours, but I do want to bring it back to this enchantment
That's
thing.
it. No, so
And
bring it back. I'm sorry. Yeah, yeah. So
no,
because
no, go
I
ahead.
see sort of where you're going here, but yeah.
But the thing is this. Okay, so we've talking about how you can't have ersatz traditions. In a sense, a broken tradition is no tradition, and you can't engage in silly role playing and play acting. But maybe in some sense, though, that's being a little harsh. Maybe in some sense, attempts at retrieving broken traditions, severed traditions, is maybe in some sense a new beginning. All we have left. In this sense, I remember I was in Washington, D.C. once at a Fides et Ratio conference sponsored by the late David L. Schindler at the Communio headquarters, at the JP2 Institute headquarters. And they had there, as at the symposium, the French Catholic thinker Jean-Luc Marion, who I know you're familiar with. And he got to talking about, and this was like 20 years ago, but he was already talking about new forms of procreation, in vitro fertilization, and stuff like that. And of course, contraception. And then, of course, the whole LGBTQ thing was coming up. And he said something very interesting, which struck me. And Remy Brogg was there too. And I think it struck him. where Jean-Luc Marion said it won't be too much longer before, if Catholics just stick to their guns, we'll be the only ones doing marriage and family the old-fashioned natural way.
Mhm.
And eventually that will come around to be attractive again to
Mhm.
our, you know. And I think we see this. I mean, part of Trump getting elected, I think, to do with exhaustion over things like men can get pregnant, women can have penises, and silly things like
Mhm.
that. If Catholics just stick to their guns. So my point then is, in terms of re-enchanting things, maybe there is something though to an attempt to retrieve certain classical forms of the Christian tradition and beauty. You think of the rededication of Notre Dame Cathedral. Why was that important? Because we don't have anything even remotely close to Notre Dame Cathedral today, and there's something important about it. So maybe it isn't just all ersatz silliness to try
Yeah.
and reach. You
Yeah,
get my point.
which I didn't take you as saying that 'cause I don't think
Yeah,
that you know you have to
we have
kind of
a patrimony, and
that's
it's
it exactly.
beautiful. And it's not
And
just
that's
an intellectual patrimony, it's a
exactly.
musical patrimony, an architectural patrimony.
And it's gonna and it is, it is gonna have a certain discontinuity if you're becoming more engrossed in that. It's gonna have a discontinuity with the gray, awful consumerist like pablum of the
Yeah,
culture,
yeah,
right? And so you're gonna be like a kid who's trying on roles, trying to figure yourself out. And there's gonna be an element
yeah.
of the awkwardness of like teenagerdom that's part of trying to do this. And I think it is important to remember that because it's yeah, otherwise it becomes Chap and Miner decided they wanted to grumble about the trads and whomever else, right? But it is a natural part of trying to basically figure out an identity,
Yeah,
in a way.
yeah.
And I guess but you just have to encounter it as something that's a gift. You have to encounter it as a gift and not as something that you know what I mean, that you're
That's the
making.
thing.
That's the thing.
It can't be put to use as a kind of ecclesial ideology, if you want to
Yeah,
put it
it's
that
not a good
way.
one. Yeah,
No, it has to be an attempt to create something truly fresh and new, but drawn from the tradition that captures us,
yeah,
that draws. I mean, I'm, my good friend Bishop Robert Barron likes to say the reason why he chose with Word on Fire to lead with beauty is that beauty just naturally draws you in. And once it draws you in, it is a way of capturing you.
yeah,
And that's kind of what you and I think, today are sort of groping after here. How does the church today capture people in that way?
yeah.
As
And how do we
C.S.
let ourselves get captured? That's it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That as well too. Like, what's the
Lewis
conversion that's necessary for
C.S.
that?
Lewis describes salvation as a good infection.
Good
You know,
fish. Yeah,
in mere Christianity, he
yeah,
says, how do we get there's bad infections and good infections? Well,
yeah,
salvation is a good infection. How do we get the infection inside of us?
yeah. Because infection probably just comes. It's in facere, isn't it? I mean,
That's right.
yeah,
First off, you have to have something that's infectious.
yeah, yeah. Exactly. And infectious has that. It has that neutral. It can go either way. That expression.
That's right. I mean, you've had to say it's not just, oh, I caught this bug or whatever. I mean, you can use the word infectious to mean, wow,
Yeah,
that's that
yeah,
that's it's gone viral. That's
yeah,
gone viral,
yeah. Exactly. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, metaphor, man. Metaphor does a lot of work for you. Even there's a metaphor, but
Yeah.
um,
So how do
yeah.
you get Christianity to go viral? Well, in a sense, you've got to, and here's where technology actually might be a mixed blessing, right?
Mhm.
Because what technology takes away, maybe technology in a sense can also help to
So it
give
can give
back.
in a certain sense. Like think about like how
Yeah.
different it is like from like what we had technologically available, even in my memory, because I'm at least
Yeah.
pre-internet. Um, Whereas at night, my house is actually biracial because my wife is still Roman Catholic. So, and my kids have to grow up having a sense of how to live in the West because heaven knows where they'll live, right?
Yeah.
Like I can't guarantee like that they're going to be in a place where they can stay Eastern. So my wife wants to do, understandably, during Philip's fast is our um pre-Christmas, pre-nativity season, but during proper Advent, we do an Advent wreath too. And this is going to get fire from some people are going to say, listen, he's still Latin. But all their friends are Westerners, right, for their homeschooling and all
Yeah.
that. They have to have a sense of this. And I can pull up, some Advent song. We don't have a lot of that kind of stuff in our tradition, but like I can expose my kids to just some little piece 3 minutes,
That's
four
right.
minutes of Christian beauty after we pray our prayers and the lights on and everything's dark, you know, you're not gonna quote unquote save the world on that, but boy, you can save your children's soul, and that's the only thing that God's gonna ask you about is that. So the
That's
technology
right.
helped with that, I guess. Is yeah,
Yeah, it can, and it can help things go viral in a sense in
yeah.
our day. And I just remember I was talking to a friend, Father Michael Wirtz, last night. He came over to our house for dinner. He's a Holy Cross priest, great guy. And we were talking about technology. And I said, I remember I'm such an old fart. I can remember in the late 1960s, the main downtown library of Lincoln, Nebraska, the Bennett Martin Public Library, established this sort of thing was called call a librarian or call a reference librarian, where if you wanted to find some fact or something, or they're like, okay, the name of an actor or the name of a movie or how far away the sun is from the earth or whatever, you could call this number to the library and talk to a reference librarian, and they would look it up for you. And
Uh-huh.
if they couldn't find it immediately, they would call you back. All right. And I actually, as a young little nerdy kid, used that service many, many times. And now I look back and I'm laughing because that's sort of like primitive going online, right? It was
Yeah.
called a line. And by the way, I dialed on a rotary phone to
Okay.
reach the librarian,
I
and
we
that,
still had that here actually. This is my grandparents' house that I have now.
there's
I
a
still
rotary.
have a rotary phone in the back. Yep.
I'm jealous. I'm
Oh,
jealous.
we don't still have it. No, we don't still have. I'm saying when I was a
Oh,
kid.
oh
So
yeah, we
no,
were a
no,
kid.
it's all
Yeah.
that. But I still
Yeah.
remember here. Yeah.
When we moved to this farm, a friend of mine gave us a rotary phone, and I thought, oh god, we tried to get it to work, it just never worked. But anyway, the point being is that yeah, I'm perfectly happy now to be able to sit down and Google the
Yeah.
same, and a lot of young people today don't have to call the Bennett Martin Library on their Ask a Librarian line. They have access. So there's a sense in which, yeah, the technology is a two-edged sword here. I mean, it can really numb us to the elemental things of our existence, and we need to have an ascetical detachment from it. But it can also open up I mean, at our fingertips is
Yeah.
this vast wealth of knowledge.
Knowledge and the of the arts of like within our tradition,
Yeah,
broadly speaking, the tradition of the civilization that has birthed us. Um, Latin tradition has great hymnody. Like think about like all those old liturgical hymns for the your breviary.
yeah,
You can get all those great. I mean, the Oxford Movement translations are still like the best because it was their language, right?
yeah.
That's English is their language, and they knew how to do it. And you can get that stuff. Like you can go on Twitter and bitch to people, right? And show people how you're right. Or you can use it. I mean, I know this sounds so for good or evil. I mean, technology has a logic to it, right? So we shouldn't ignore that fact. But
Well,
that's what
Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message.
it does exactly. So
It's
let's not,
overall
yeah,
negative in my view.
yeah, exactly. Because I mean, it's something that can be used as part of recovery. Again, lived in the context of the community in which you find yourself, in which you're in via. This is your stage of being a wayfarer in the church right now. And you just fulfill your duties like where you're at. I mean, I feel like
Yeah.
I've been saying that for like 15 or 20 years. And it's probably what made me a Benedictine. I don't know who it is in my family, like who ingrained that in me, because it must go deep if I just say it all the time.
Yeah,
But
it probably does. Hey, look, we've been at this about an hour and a
a
half.
long
We
time.
should
Yeah.
we should
Yeah.
probably wind this up. It's been, but do you have any last things that you want to toss in here? We don't necessarily have to end abruptly. Uh,
Here, we'll just say, so what's it like on the farm? What do you do? What do you do? I mean, my Christmas this year, as you can see, we're under construction, kind of boring. We actually do, even though I have no Italian in me, we actually just do lot of big, expensive charcuterie, and then we don't have many relatives
yeah,
coming there, though, just because of the nature of the
yeah.
year.
This
But
year
what do
for
you do?
us, normally it just involves my family is all out in Nebraska, but my wife Carrie, her family's all in New Jersey. So we almost always, spend Christmas and all the major holidays visiting her family in New
Do you get to do
Jersey.
your liturgies though? Do you get to do your liturgies at your parish?
Oh
Or?
yeah, we go to like I said, we go to an ordinary liturgy in Scranton. So we will be doing the Christmas Eve liturgy. I'm serving. I'm an adult server,
Mhm.
and so I will be serving, and my wife will be lecturing. And then the next day, Christmas, yeah, we'll head over to her mother's house and celebrate some
Well, that's
Christmas over
great
there.
then. I mean, because your dad's still alive, not your mother though.
No, my mother's alive. My dad
Oh,
is 91 and he's got COPD and he's in bad shape, but he's going strong.
that's
Uh, he's he's overweight. He chain smoked most of his life. And,
The
you know,
COPD stuff. That's what my
eats all
grandmother.
eats all the wrong thing, and yet there he is, 91,
Right, he's
going
90
some.
something, yeah.
My
But then
mom is my mom is almost 89, but she has dementia, so she's actually in
uh,
bad shape. Yeah,
but then
bad shape.
your wife's parents are still around too.
No, my wife's mother is alive, but her father passed away from leukemia about 6 years ago now.
Okay. Yeah, but that's still, I mean, this is great that you still have them. Yeah, my folks are gone. So it's
Yeah,
it's such a blessing to be able to have the bits that
yeah.
you can get from the past generation
Yeah,
now.
I mean, even though my mom has dementia, I have not yet had to suffer through this. So it is nice to be able,
Yeah,
even though I'm not going to be in Nebraska this year for Christmas, to be able to call them on Christmas.
yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah, because you
anyway,
won't hear their voice someday. It's like I still have my grandfather on my mom's side. He sent me a message and I don't delete it. It's like every time I
oh
get a new
yeah,
phone, I make sure that message is on there just so I can hear his voice. And my grandfather from this side, I have a recording
yeah,
somewhere. Yeah, you just won't hear it someday. But
oh,
well, good.
absolutely.
Have a blessed Christmas,
You
Larry.
too, and a blessed Christmas to you as well. And thanks for coming on the show today.
It's great.
We'll have to do this again sometime.
Yeah, we'll make it happen. Stars
And
align.
it was great to touch base with you today, where we weren't arguing over nature and grace and
Yeah,
all that kind of stuff.
we'll do
All
it. We'll
right,
do that online publicly
all
so people.
right. I'll get this posted soon. Hey, thanks a lot,
Thanks.
Matthew, and thanks
Yeah.
everyone for listening. Bye now.